Julius Kuhl is my previous supervisor of my PhD thesis and habilitation, and many of the thoughts that I convey with this talk are based on his ideas, and we continuously developed this model, personality systems interaction, further throughout the last decades together. So this is why he's the co-author here. Self-growth from adversity, a Neuro-Systems perspective. Let me start with a brief anecdote of the case of Ignatius of Loyola, who suffered a major injury during a battle where his knee was shattered by a cannonball. And after this time, during recovery at the castle of his family, he went through a major spiritual conversion, as he reported in others, where he, during this time and during this suffering, decided to not continue his worldly life and chivalry, but rather live a life in serenity and in the service of God, later founding the Society of Jesus. This is just one example out of numerous examples. Much more recently, during the Second World War, like Anne Frank or Viktor Frankl, even Nelson Mandela reported similar phases of suffer and growing from this suffering. So apparently, adverse experiences can lead to something like self-growth. But it may not immediately lead to self-growth, as there are many factors that can may even be necessary in one or the other case to actually contribute to self-growth. These factors are still open to empirical research, and many are probably not really known. What actually do I mean by self-growth? I would like to clarify this throughout the talk, and the talk will also be about which processes may facilitate self-growth after adversity. What we actually do not think is the major target of growth is the ego, as it is, for example, conceptualized in psychoanalysis, like analytical thought or pure reason, so the conscious and conceptual idea of processing. So let me start with Sigmund Freud, who thought about the ego as follows. How does something become conscious? The answer would be by connecting it with the corresponding word concepts. So Sigmund Freud had the idea that the ego is closely related to language, to speech, to words, to conceptual processing. And the word rests in essentially derived from acoustic perceptions. So he sees a close connection of language with the sensory inputs that come from the external world. We find similar ideas already in the ancient Greek philosophy or in Immanuel Kant's ideas on the pure reason, which is close to sensory input and categorizing these inputs. As to Freud, the ego also plays a strong role in happiness, where it was the ego shall be. And this actually is not only a strong emphasis in, or at least early traditional psychoanalysis, but also a conception conveyed by traditional Western philosophies, even by Aristotle. But there has been much critique of analytical reason or the ego even within psychoanalysis, or by other clinical psychologists, which finally founded other approaches towards psychotherapy. Carl Gustav Jung, for example, cites the Pueblo Indians saying, "We do not understand the whites. We think that they are mad. They say that they think with their heads. We think here." Karl Kraus, for example, was kind of famous in psychology for harshly criticizing psychoanalysis, saying that psychoanalysis is the illness for which it considers itself the therapy. Yeah. Many patients have difficulty stopping rumination, which is, let's say, intense analytical thinking, yeah? And by just continuing to think analytically in psychoanalysis, you even push them more towards their actual disorders, when you have tendencies towards obsessive compulsiveness, for example, or even autistic tendencies. It's difficult to heal them with with their actual strengths. So it might be better to balance what they actually did and let them into the disorder, to balance it with something that they did not do yet. Even Plato, or in Kant's and Hegel's philosophy, there is a strong emphasis on nous, more intuitive or practical understanding, as a higher principle than pure reason. So to use logos, pure reason, in order to get to a more broad understanding and integrate ideas into a moral guidance. So the question is, especially today, when we talk of neuropsychological systems, can there be a system that is intuitive and intelligent at the same time? So other than the ego, which is not very intuitive, it's very conceptual and conscious, but is intelligent, and the ego and the id is rather conceptualized as a stupid system, not very intelligent, but intuitive or even unconscious. So backed up by research on neural networks or connectionism, Julius Kuhl developed the idea of the so-called integrative self. The integrative self as a neurocognitive system. So it is conceived of as a parallel processing network of integrated self-referential representations that includes preferences, motives, beliefs, life goals, narratives, and values. And it's important to emphasize that it's a parallel processing networks, which means that these conceptions are more pre-reflective rather than reflective, because such an amount of information cannot become conscious at the same time. The integrative self is conceived of as a system of the human psyche rather than the person as a whole or personality as a whole. So we do not equate personality with the self, or here the integrative self, or the person with the self, but we say it's a particular system other than the ego. Although still we conceive of it as the chief system which regulates and coordinates all other systems, including analytical thought. Well, there are neural underpinnings of the integrative self, and when we have a look, sagittal brain view, which means we make a slice in this direction and look from the side. So a meta-analysis from Georg Nordhoff showed that there are particularly 3 clusters in the brain that are related to self-representations across different domains like verbal, facial, and emotional ones. From these 3 clusters, it is particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the frontal brain that we would associate with the integrative self, as it has higher level functions such as intuitive decision making based on emotional relevance of or the values that are behind certain actions that we choose. It has to do with goal representation and even moral reasoning. When we take a coronal brain view, so having a slice in this direction, we also find evidence for hemisphere asymmetries in the self or the integrative self. So there are different authors like Keenan, Kircher, and so on who published work on this. And more recently, we published a study based on fMRI data where we asked people to retrieve information about whether they chose a task by themselves or whether they were just imposed with a task by a boss. And what we found is that the correct retrieval of assigned task, of imposed task, activates part of the left prefrontal cortex. I have to admit, this finding was not significant, but significant was the finding that when they correctly indicated this task, I chose this task, it was the right ventromedial prefrontal cortex activated for these self-chosen tasks. Interestingly enough, already Sigmund Freud had an idea, not about the self. He actually did not talk about the self, although he sensed, like in this work, the ego and the it, there is more than just analytical thinking, some intelligence and creative process that is intuitive during the sleep, where he thought analytical, the ego is or everything is censored and there is no ego. He sensed that there is something, but he went on not talking about it anymore. So in this work, he already made a drawing with some, how do you say that, a caption on the left prefrontal side, which he related to acoustic sensations. Because he was aware of the work from Broca and Wernicke that the left hemisphere is related to speech production and speech perception. So he said, from these relationships we can create a drawing, the contours of which only serve as a depiction that does not claim any particular interpretation. For example, we add that the ego wears a listening cap on one side only, according to the proof of brain anatomy. So in his thinking, the ego is more related to the left hemisphere, which is also consistent with more recent brain asymmetry findings on analytical thought being related to the left prefrontal cortex. Here, I would like to give you a list of key characteristics of the integrated self as it is conceived in our theory. So it is related to extended high-level parallel processing. So that's the overarching principle that actually guides and enables all other functions of the self, such as I already mentioned, that it's more pre-reflective than reflective, and it overarches experiential and pictorial thoughts rather than fully conceptual thoughts. So it is vigilant because it has many preferences, and self aspects on mind, it is vigilant to personally relevant aspects. So when we go through this world mindfulnessly, we are better able to perceive things that we are interested in. And this can include others. It should even include others, depending on whether other people are parts of yourself. Extended outcome processing. So today we might use the word mindful, but there are some differences between mindful and vigilant processing. So felt feedback, that we can get feedback from other people or from the circumstances themselves, and recognize our failures and integrate them in a broader network of already existing experiences and self aspects. This also gives us some sort of responsibility for the world and our life, rather than to see ourselves as a victim. Extended emotional and somatosensory connectivity, probably via the right insula and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, including needs and bodily perceptions, are more strongly related to this system, to this neurosystem, rather than the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left or right side, more related to analytical thought and planning. This, for example, is the reason why some people rather tend to analytically plan and think rather than to go into their emotions, which psychoanalysts called affect isolation or intellectualization. The integration of negative with positive experiences. So when we face the truth and integrate negative experiences, we link it to already existing positive experiences that we made in our lives, so with positive self aspects, and this gives us meaning and gives us higher positivity even during the phase of suffering. I will talk about this later. The integrated self actually starts to develop already with early experiences with parents that may give us, hopefully, a sense of being an important person. And in these mutual interactions where mirror neurons play a strong role, you get a very early sense of being worthy, as attachment theory, for example, supposes. So when we are able to access this system is not continuously active. It can be suppressed by stress and negative affect, where we just have emergency reactions like fight-flight reactions, or that we start thinking about problems and then we distance from, let's say, our bodily feelings, because it's urgent at the very moment, apparently, to solve some problems, but we disconnect from the self. So self-access means that we are able to access this very system. In coaching or psychotherapy, we might say that the patient or the client opens up to the conversation, and when it becomes very personal. So the idea, or some roots of the idea of the integrative self, are already existing for many decades in psychotherapeutic approaches too, not only in philosophy. So, for example, Carl Gustav Jung was talking about the self, taking the self from Hinduist and Buddhist thoughts, and had this strong idea, the individuation as an integration of opposing sides of the psyche into the self, just for example. Otto Rank, Heinz Kohut, the founder of self-psychology, Paul Goodman, Carl Rogers, just to name a few, and I don't want to go deeply into that. Here is a little poem and a part of a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke to the Princess, saying, and it very much reflects what we would conceive of as self-growth. Only sometimes, as we painfully ripen, so close to almost dying, then from everything we do not comprehend, a countenance forms and looks us radiant. So I don't know if it's a good translation. I tried, so I couldn't find it on the internet. It's a German poem, and it's a pity that it's not very well received in the English language, apparently, given the internet. Yeah, so this is something what we would more relate to the growth of the integrative self rather than the ego or some competencies. Yeah? And from everything we do not comprehend means that there is an unconscious processes going on, yeah, which very much reflects the processing of the self as a pre-reflective or even unconscious system. So self-growth is meant as a specific form of personality growth that refers to enhancement in its integrativeness or differentiation. Some people talk about adding complexity to the self, integrating more negative experiences into the self. So how can this work? What can be, let's say, the neuropsychological mechanisms underlying this process? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. The ironic relationship between agony and the self during suffering. Is it suffering itself that helps us grow, or what mechanism is it actually? So the ego and the self, or let's say parts of the ego is actually not just one entity. When we talk about the ego or talk about similar conceptions, when we look closer, it's different subsystems and that interact with each other in a certain way. They to some degree cooperate in a way that we could call this complex of interactions between systems, the ego. But the ego also interacts with the self in a certain way. Let's show it this way. So first of all, system activations, even in the brain, are inert. They show some aspects of inertia. The more intense you activate one system, the more difficult it becomes to you to switch. So when you constantly are busy with analytical thought, it's hard for you to easily switch, typically. Yeah? And some people have an inclination, by nature or early experiences, their personality, to constantly be in the ego rather than the self. Other people are more in the self than the ego, and some other have some flexibility. There's also interhemispheric inhibition, which can be one potential mechanism of this mutual inhibition of the two systems. However, so when there is some inhibition, what helps us to switch? And as both theoretical thought and empirical support, you can read it up in the papers that we wrote, it is changes in affective states or in affect intensity that facilitate the connection of the two systems, switching between the systems or disconnecting them. And by connecting the two systems, they have the opportunity to exchange information in a way that, for example, the analytical thoughts that you have made about your life can be compared with your more experiential thought and your narratives in the self, and can be integrated. So as to agony and self-growth, we think of self-growth of at least two phases. One we could call agony. It's intense negative affect that activates the ego, particularly the error detection system in the brain, which looks at, oh, what's not correct here? I wanted to have it differently. Why isn't it this way? It activates a focus on discrepancies, and at the same time blocks the extended parallel processing of the self. So we get into kind of a tunnel vision in the first phase. The person is basically urged to face the adverse reality, which can be external threats, but can also be internal shadows, as Carl Gustav Jung would say, things that we do not want to know about ourselves. So adversity activates the error detection system, also via a very quick way, according to Joseph Ledoux, via the thalamus and the amygdala, activating negative affect. In a second phase, the phase of integration, the negative affect becomes downregulated. After a time, we get used to something, so negative affect comes down by nature or by self-compassion, self-relaxation, because we may have learned during the first 1 or 2 years of life by intense positive interactions with the parents to self-regulate and to regulate down our negative emotions, or by others who give us social support, who give us consolation and empathy. So these two phases of facing the truth, looking at the details, looking what is not correct, and down-regulating negative affect helps us connect the ego with the self and to integrate negative experiences. And these two steps or phases are repetitive over the process of suffering. It can be every day, it can be every hour, every minute. Every morning I wake up after the separation I suffered, seeing that what went wrong, suffering as if there's no end. But after some time, the more you down-regulate it by yourself, yourself can grow by the experience of down-regulating your emotions. It's like a conditioning process, a conditioning of systems. The more the self becomes activated after you experience the suffer, the more closely the connection becomes between the systems. So, I already said, relief can be found through self-relaxation, acceptance, reappraisal, or personal understanding, consolation from others. So what about persistently intense negative affect and concomitant ego activation? Well, they may delay integration, because we cannot down-regulate. We're constantly in a negative affect. We may even say it hampers integration, but it may delay integration for many years, decades, maybe even ending up in despair and dying, not having integrated certain thoughts, as Erik Erikson would say, not ending up as an integrated person, but rather in despair. Well, we could also say it's a delay of integration, but unfortunately the person died before. So maybe this is why some some theologies think of having a rebirth, where you can solve your problems. I don't know. This is very philosophical now, or esoteric. Okay. Negativism and dysphoria persist if phase 2, the integration phase, cannot be entered. So we see, I remember even a friend of mine saying that I lost my sense of self, I even lost faith in God with this depression. I have been faithful all the time. So you get stuck in, let's say, the tunnel vision and are unable to see the big picture from the perspective of the integrative self. Persistent negative affect, the absence of negative affect in one's life may foster even hedonistic selfishness rather than self-growth. So when you do not need to regulate yourself and constantly are happy, there was nothing in your life, your parents did everything to prevent you from some negative things, well, there's no need to make integration. So your integrated self is not that integrated, it stays rather shallow and superficial. It's the integrative self, so it has the potential to integrate, but if there's no need and you don't do it and just live a hedonistic life, nothing might happen. So no self-growth. So it's not the total absence of negative affect, it's that fosters self-growth, it's the down-regulation of negative affect. So this is just a brief view at the core assumptions of personality systems interactions, not to give you the impression that we are just thinking of two systems and how they dialectically interact with each other. So it's a little bit more complex, and even this is just an excerpt. So for example, you can see on the left upper side and right downside that there are two systems, the discrepancy detection system, the planning system, which we, when we try to communicate it to non-psychologists, call it the ego. Why do we need intense experience? Do we actually need intense experience to grow? This has to do with what may be called accommodative growth. So Tedeschi and Calhoun were talking about this already 20 years before. Julius Kuhl, basically at a similar time, 2006, where he published something about this. This is, well, a famous prayer from Reinhold Niebuhr, which later became famous as the so-called serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. So people typically tend to try to change things rather than to give up on their status quo, on their standards, on their ideals, on their needs. They want to satisfy their needs. They want to go for things. They try as hard as they can because, well, these worldviews that they gathered, the identities, the life goals, they give them self-esteem and pleasure, and people already have invested a lot in them throughout their lives, so they do not want to give it up. Therefore, individuals firstly try to cope by assimilation. Accommodation, assimilation, terms that are borrowed from Jean Piaget, who described cognitive development, borrowed to describe emotional or socio-emotional development. So assimilation means adapting the environment to my own needs and aspirations, trying hard to do everything that I can reach my goals. So assimilative growth, if we want to call it growth means that we try to improve our behavioral strategies to change the world. This is basically a core idea of behavioral therapy, that you try to just help the person to function, yeah? Dealing on the symptoms level. Accommodative growth, or seismic growth, as Tedeschi and Calhoun called it, means intense, seemingly incorrectable schema discrepancies, which we also can call error from a systems perspective, urge the organism to a thorough change in the worldview, attitude, or even a need. So this is what we actually would rather conceive of as growth when we talk of growth. So it's more a thorough transformation of the person as described in the case of Ignatius of Loyola. And this is what actually psychoanalysis tries to do, rather than to healing the symptoms, to go in the depth of your heart, as Eleanor may say. And so this necessitates strong adversity, because otherwise there's no good reason for you to change things. So let me rather come to an end and have some additional ideas on self-growth. So do we always need adversity? Well, we may need adversity after we have led a life where we did not include or did not have self-access. Yeah? We're not in contact with our deep wishes, values, or in contact emotionally, empathetically with other people. So then it might be necessary, but people can just naturally grow, yeah? Which means that they have a good foundation of interactions with, during early parenting with their parents, which creates basic trust and inner security. And afterwards, they are faced consecutively with challenges of mild adversity. No? So this could be another route. No? But well, the talk actually is about growing after adversity, after intense adversity. So this is basically not the focus of the talk. We may also ask the question, could there be intense positive experiences like childbirth that can change, make changes? You know? Maybe. Well, when we look at the empirical findings on childbirth, it's not so much the case. There's an intense hormonal phase afterwards where parents are very lucky. But then there's stress, and we see on average a decline in happiness post-birth, depression and things like that, and all the happiness is gone for a while at least. So this is up to empirical research to show the degree to which positive experiences, strong positive experience, can make major changes in life. Self-growth is not selfish. The self is not selfish. Maybe the ego that is selfish, because the self enables to open up. It is connected to emotions. It actually develops via mutual interactions, intense interactions with parents, other people, and the self, because of its extended processing, actually provides the possibility that you do not stay in your bubble of goals, but that you have a broad overview of the environment, of the perspectives and needs of other people, not only your own, which is much more when you are so focused, like the ego, reflecting, you do not see what happens in the outside of the world. So it enables unselfish charity, giving love rather than just taking love because of a strong need, which can also be narcissistic. I talked about integrating adverse representations of adverse experiences into the integrative self. But there's a large literature, like for example, self-determination theory, talking about the internalization of values and goals into the self. Well, we have basically the same mechanism postulated in some papers, that it's very important that you have self-access, that your self needs to be activated, open up to integrate alien, or alien in a sense that it comes from the external world, from other people, to integrate other values and goals into yourself and making them yourself. So the process of integration rather than introjection, as psychoanalysts would say. Okay, this is maybe a theological, philosophical question, but maybe a way on how we could think from a broad perspective, theology and psychology could cooperate. So when we have these two systems of ego and self, and let me just roughly depict them onto the two hemispheres. It's really a rough depiction. And these ideas are basically written down in Spiritual Intelligence from Julius School. He talks of a minor and a major transcendence. The minor transcendence is within the person. It's a dialogue between systems. It's opening up, it's activating the self, which can provide you with heaven on earth already, with eudaimonic well-being, finding yourself maybe via suffering. So Carl Gustav Jung may talk of God within us. And the major transcendence is to God. Maybe not via this direct way. This could be without integrating the self. And when you directly come from analytical thought to God, it may end up with inquisition and idealistic ideas, fundamentalistic ideas, when you are not in contact with yourself. So that's the danger of the major transcendence without doing the minor transcendence first or in parallel. The minor or inner transcendence is probably a question of psychology, but maybe also of theology. So there's where the two disciplines meet. And the major transcendence from the person to God is a theological question. But maybe, I'll leave it open, also a psychological question. And this is where we can see how the discourse among psychology and theology will go its way. Okay, let me sum up what I have said so far. Self-growth refers to the development of the integrative self as the chief system of the human psyche. The integrative self as a high-level intelligent system has been neglected in Western philosophies and psychology to a large degree. Adversity contingent self-growth requires both A, intense experiences and agony, as well as B, relief from negative affect during the process of suffering. The neuropsychological mechanism behind self-growth may be seen in a repetitive dialogue between mental systems, such as parts of the ego and the self. And self-access may be conceived of as an inner transcendence, as small, minor transcendence as compared to the major transcendence. So to wrap it up, I think there's large potential of psychology to contribute to theological questions and to cooperate together in theology and psychology. And this is what basically our project here is about. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank my home and former universities that supported this research and the empirical research. my collaborating partners, in particular Julius Kuhl, Richard Ryan, and Godehard Bründrup. My PhD students, 2 of them are here. Yeah. And all the anonymous participants that went through these slides continuously and helped us with the empirical research. And please, thank you.